Hey everybody, I'm Amanda with DevExpress, and welcome to the second part in our two-part webinar series, Optimizing ASP.NET Performance, presented by DevExpress Web Program Manager Mehul and Technical Evangelist Don Wibier. In this webinar, you'll learn a few best practices, tips, and tricks to improve performance of your ASP.NET web projects. Mehul and Don will show you how the DevExpress real-world application demos were improved after refactoring, and in this part, we'll take a look at the final 6 items that you'll find useful for performance in a large web project. Mehul will cover callbacks, the ASPxButton, and creating a sticky footer, and Don will cover the Bing map control and various other tips. All right, thanks for joining us. I will now hand things over to Mehul and Don.
Thank you, Amanda. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to Best Practices, Tricks and Tips, Optimizing ASP.NET Performance, and this is part 2. And I'm here with my partner in crime, Don. Don, how are you doing over there in Europe?
Hey Mehul, I'm all excited to show some more cool tips and tricks in this webinar.
Excellent. All right, so let's just do a quick recap. Since this is part 2, this webinar is really about real-world applications like the Sales Viewer demo. And we focus on the Sales Viewer because that's one of the most recent demos that we created. And every time we do one of these demos, we learn some lessons from it. Now, things that we've already known, but we don't always just apply them right away. Sometimes, we want to make sure that there is a problem to solve. And so what we want to show you in part 1, we showed you a lot of patterns and some best practices and so forth. And in this demo, we're going to show you more of the tips and tricks. But let's do a quick recap of part 1. As I mentioned, this is the Sales Viewer demo, which you can find online. And I will show it to you here. So if you go to the DevExpress.com website, you'll find it under ASP Demos. Now, this demo is designed like a dashboard style. So I'll just give you a quick recap. Every time you click an item here, the data gets updated. We've got this awesome little control down here. You might be wondering what that is. Well, you're going to find out today. So it's an awesome control that you can actually build easily. And we've got a lot of controls in here. We've got things like a pivot grid and a grid, and you can see the performance is really awesome, and that's because we've optimized for that. And so we want to show you how you can get DevExpress ASP.NET controls that you are thinking about using to get it to the same level of performance, and of course the beauty is built right in. And so last week we covered the 3 major tips that I covered were general data access. Now, the first one was general data access, and that was talking about how to get required fields only. And that meant not just if you were doing a SQL query, but let's say you were using some kind of model. And then I talked about using something called a data transfer object. Now, if you haven't seen it, this video of the part 1 is available on YouTube. Now, the second tip was using cache. If you store data in the cache, you can get huge performance improvements. But you have to be careful in that you don't store large amounts of data and data that can change very often. So store static data that does not change very often, and you can get huge performance improvements, just like the data access tip above. And finally, if you're using a pivot grid, you can vastly improve performance by using an OLAP cube on Microsoft SQL Server, or use the new server mode feature that is part of the last release, 14.2. Now, all of that is covered in part 1. So, but I wasn't the only one. My partner in crime here, Don. Don, you talked about some chart stuff. Now, why is a common palette useful for charts performance?
Well, Mehul, it saves server resources and it helps you with the user interface as well.
Ah, okay. And this transparent bars tip that you showed, what was that useful for?
Well, in some situations you want to display those bars, but you don't want to give it too much attention. And in that particular case, it's very useful.
Nice. And finally, the auto series. Is that helpful with charts?
If you're doing a lot of charts like the Sales Viewer, it speeds up development time because you are defining the charts series by your business logic, and that is just for maintenance very good.
Excellent. All right. So let's just dive right into the first of a few tips that I'll be showing. Now, the first one I want to talk about is a sticky footer. So what is a sticky footer? Well, on a website like the Sales Viewer, you're going to find if you go to the bottom, a footer area. Now, generally, you know about the header area. This is the main body content area. The footer is an area where you can store things like a logo or a call to action. Now, in the Sales Viewer demo, we've got this sticky footer, and right now it's going to be a little bit hard to see. So we optimize these webinars so that they're not too big. So I've got 1600 by 900, and so what I'm going to do is I'm going to zoom out of this website so we can see that footer a little bit better, and you can see how what the term sticky means. Now, when I zoom out here, now I can easily see the footer. So keep your eye on the bottom footer area there, and as I resize the screen, you see the footer stays at the bottom. So it's sticky. It sticks to the bottom. It's where I want it to be. Now, as I scroll up, you'll notice that as it hits the main content area, it says, whoops, sorry, I've reached my limit, and it starts disappearing into the bottom. Now, I can still access it because now the scroll bar is still there. So it tells the document, hey, listen, I've gone as far as I can go, and now I must, you're going to stick with the main content area. And so how do we achieve this? Well, it's actually not so hard, and I want to show you how we achieve this. So the way we approach it in Sales Viewer is by using CSS. Now, I've made a little sample demo here to create this. Now, this is simply just a standard DevExpress project template. I'm sorry, an empty project template from DevExpress, and in it I've added a default ASPX page which has a grid view on it, and it just binds to a Northwind database. Now the magic happens in two places. First in the site.master page, the default derives from site.master page, and this is where I define things like the main area and the footer area. So you need to define a couple of divs. The first div is the main area. Now the main area for me is the header and the content holder. This is the top of the page, and I define it by main area so I can do some things in the CSS. And then the footer area is what I want to have it stuck at the bottom. And also, this, I'll start with demo 2 here. This is also achieved through the CSS. Now in CSS, you might be asking, oh no, Mehul, you're not going to talk about CSS. Well, I'm going to because, as we were preparing this webinar, I talked to a lot of the support devs and the ASP devs in our company, and they said, if there's one tip I would really recommend our customers to do is to learn CSS. Now, our CTO Julian, he does a lot of great stuff with JavaScript, and he's done a few personal blog posts on his site because he's always playing with that site about CSS. But if there's one tip that we would give you is that learn more CSS. And CSS can be tricky. On the simple side, it's very easy to grasp, right? You've got a tag, and you're defining your properties of what you're going to have it do. So, for example, I said the body I don't want any margins or padding on it. I've got a font family, and in that sense, it's very simple. But it can get complicated when you start seeing things like positions and padding and so forth. So, I'm going to show you how this footer is achieved, and actually, this is all you really need for the footer. And most of this stuff is pretty self-evident with paddings and margins and height and so forth. What I mainly want to talk about today is position and padding. So we see in the HTML in the form, we're telling it that the form, which is our form tag, everything in the form, is going to be what's called relative. Now, you might be asking yourself, well, what does those terms mean? So I'm going to quickly talk about those terms. Now, if we go to the W3 Schools definition for CSS position, you're going to find 6 different definitions, and Visual Studio at least displays the first 4 of these. So if you read each one, you think, oh, well, hey, I know how to read documentation. It's going to make absolute perfect sense. I got to tell you, it's not always that clear. The best way, and of course, the best way to learn anything, is to play with it. And therefore, some of these definitions are pretty evident. So, for example, we know what static means. Static means the elements are rendered as they appear in the document flow. And absolute is defined as the position relative to its first positioned ancestor element, which is not static. And relative means it's positioned relative to its normal position. And fixed means it's fixed. It's relative to the browser window. So, unfortunately, these aren't really clear, but I guarantee if you play with these samples that they have here, it becomes very clear. So in our case, it will be pretty evident. So for example, position relative, as it says in the documentation, it's relative to the browser. And so what we wanted to do is we defined the form there, but really the footer is defined as absolute, meaning I want it absolutely in one area, and that is where the div resides, which is the very last position in the form. And finally, we set a width of 100% because I wanted to span the width of the browser. I don't have a bottom margin. I set a height, a fixed height of 100 pixels. This isn't a percentage. I don't want it to be a percentage because I don't want it to grow and shrink as I resize the browser. I want it at a fixed height. And so I've set it to 100 pixels. You want to make it enough for the content that's in your footer. And I give it a little separate different color so that it shows the offset. Now, I'll come back to this main area in just a second, but let's take a look at this in the browser. So when we run this, I've got my footer area. And as I scroll up, you see it sticks to the bottom, but as I hit the main content area, it disappears. And that's because if we take a look at the demo to CSS, the main area, which in our site master is defined as this div that holds the header and the content area, has a bottom padding. And that is equal to the footer height, which is 100 pixels. So if I change this footer height to 110, I need to change it here as well. And that's because what this allows me to do is that it says, listen, main area has a bottom padding of 110 pixels, so that when I resize the browser is aware, the document is aware that that bottom padding should override and that that footer, it cannot overtake the content area. And so that's awesome because, you know, this now gives me that sticky footer while not getting in my way. Now, that said, there's a lot of different ways to do things in CSS. This is one approach to getting a sticky footer. So if you take a look at CSStricks.com, which is a very useful little site, you'll find there's another approach. Now, as I was talking with Don used to work on CMSs using DevExpress ASP.controls. He's written hundreds of sites. And Don, you said you took a different approach when you were making sticky footers. What did you use?
Yeah, that's correct. I have used the so-called negative margin approach, which is also one of the well-known CSS tricks to get a sticky footer.
Right.
And I think it's described here.
Right. And so basically, there are many ways to do it, and if you look at the CS sticky footer approach here on CSS Tricks, what they're doing is slightly different. Now, you might say, well, they've got all this page wrap and all that. You know, that's not important. You can absolutely take this approach, right? I mean, they're just using slightly different names for their div tags and so forth. But what the important part is, if we want to use that approach, I'll show it to you by using this other demo file that I've got in here. Now, don't worry, I'll be posting all of this code on our GitHub, on our Don's GitHub or mine or whatever. But basically, you'll notice that all the CSS is exactly the same, except for in the main area, I'm not using a padding bottom. As you'll notice, I was using a padding bottom here, and here I'm using a margin bottom. And here I'm telling it, listen, the main area's margin bottom is minus 130 pixels. And so what this does, it has a different effect. So let's take a look at this effect. Now, the effect we get with this is that now, as I scroll up, it overrides my main content. It's sticky in the classical definition sense in that it's going to stay on top even though I'm now getting to my content area. So, as I mentioned, it really depends on what you decide to do. If you'd rather have one that just disappears when you hit the main content area, you can use the padding bottom approach or this one. Now, I guarantee if you look long enough, you'll find even other approaches to doing this in CSS. And that's why I mentioned, you know, take a look at some the kind of site like CSS Tricks, which is actually has a lot of great stuff. Julian mentioned to me that he's actually used a lot of tips from this site for his own personal website. So, and if you have questions about DevExpress and CSS, you know, definitely ask our support team. They can help you with a lot of these little tips as well. All right, let's move on because we've got a lot more to show. And the next thing I want to talk about is this, the global events object. Now, Don, you had mentioned to me that you found this quite useful. So what exactly is the global events control?
This global event control is a non-visual control which lets you do some really cool stuff with the DevExpress ASP.NET controls on the client.
Awesome. All right, so let's take a look at this in the browser. Now, we've got a. Let's start with the sales viewer. So first of all, you'll find this control in your toolbox by just searching for global, and it's actually a server-side control. Now you might say, wow, a server-side control. Yes, it's a server-side control that exposes to you several DevExpress ASP.NET client-side events. So if you take a look at ASPX Global Events, when you drop this, this is a non-visual control, as Don just mentioned. That means it doesn't do anything visual. But when you drop it on the page, it allows you to access client-side events. Now, because it derives off of other objects, it's got some server-side properties, but the main ones that are the ones that allow you to hook into the client-side one. So let's take a look at the client-side object for the ASPX Global Events. Now, if you're not familiar, a lot of DevExpress controls, most of them have a client-side object as well. So the server-side objects usually start with ASPX and the name of the object. And the client-side version of those start with ASPX and insert the word client right afterwards. So for example, for ASPX Data View, it'd be ASPX Client Data View. For ASPX Global Events, it's ASPX Client Global Events. And you can find that just by typing in the name in search, and it'll bring it to you. So in the ASPX Client Global Events, we see that it's got several events available and exposed to you. And these are client-side events that let you hook and do things like callbacks. So let's say you have several DevExpress controls on a page, and once those controls have finished some action, you want to react to those. Well, how do you know? Well, this is the object that lets you do that. And the one I want to talk about today is this controls initialized. The DevExpress support guys call this sort of like the global init event. And what it means, controls initialized, it says when you use this event, this event notifies you when all DevExpress controls on a page have finished initializing. And you might say, well, that sounds kind of like jQuery.ready. And that's exactly what it's like. It's a lot like jQuery ready in that it lets you know, hey, listen, all the controls have finished loading their scripts and images and callbacks and so forth. They're ready to go. And therefore, this controls initialize lets you do things when something is finished. So what can you do? Well, you can do some cool things, like if you take a look at controls initialized event particularly, and you scroll down, you'll find examples, a lot of examples in here as well. So you'll find this example, which allows you to set the visibility of the controls. So what this says is, like, let's say you have several ASP.NET controls on one page, and some of your end users' browsers are not very fast, or their machines are slow or something. And so if you find that, you know, as those controls are loading, some of them are flickering or something like that, what you can do is set their client visible property to false by initially. So wrap them all in a panel, set the panel's client visibility to false, and then set it to true after the controls have initialized. So what does that look like? Well, if we run this, let's say I've got a splitter with an HTML editor. Now, as you'll see, I should warn you, I'll try to go very slow, and unfortunately, what I recommend you actually run this demo locally so you get a better effect. But because to the GoToWebinar, you may not see it refreshing as fast as I do, so I'll try to go a little slower. But what happens is, as I refresh, the content is not flickering at all. Now, I apologize if it flickers for you. That may just be the webinar software. But if you run it locally, you'll see that what's happened is I've got all my controls in a panel that its visibility is set to false from the client side. And what happens is when the page loads, so I just did a refresh. As this page loads, it says, hey, listen, I'm going to set the visibility to false, and I'm going to set it to true only when everything is finished initializing. That means the scripts have all loaded for the splitter, for this HTML editor, and then I'll set it to true, so that way there's the client-side visibility, the client's experience is much better. And that's an awesome approach. Now, you can do something else with the controls initialize. Well, you can do a ton of things, anything you imagine. But one thing that I like is this loading panel. Let's say you want to display a loading panel because you have several charts or several pivot grids, or you've got just several controls, and it takes a long time because they connect with a slow database or remote server or something like that. Well, what you can do is you can display a loading panel. So when I run this example, this E4013, what happens is on load, it displays for us a loading panel. Now, once the loading panel has finished loading, it disappears. So how do we do this? Well, let's take a look. Now, if you open this by clicking this example, it'll actually download this. Now, if you've never done this before, the first time it'll download a little application like an example runner. But what's great about these code tutorial examples that I'm showing is they're fully running examples that can work directly in your Visual Studio. So even if you don't have the latest version installed, if you're a version or two behind, as long as it's one of the supported versions, you can download the example and open it up right up in Visual Studio. And that's what I've got right here with this example, E4013. So this example essentially is just this default ASPX page, which just has a couple of links for the menu. So I've got this onload and on postback. And if we take a look at the onload page, in it, what we've got in our form is a loading panel. So the loading panel has a client instance name, which creates a client-side object for the loading panel called LP, which allows me to get it at its client-side property. And I'm telling it that I want it to be shown modally, which means that no other dialogues will pop up, that it takes the focus until it's finished. And finally, I've got a little script method that just says right away, hey, as soon as this page loads, show the loading panel. So the first thing I want to do is say, listen, I've got a loading panel, I want you to show it right away. And the reason is we're going to find out when everything is finished by looking at this controls initialized. So the controls initialized method, if we take a look at this client-side event, says typically what we want it to do is it says, listen, the loading panel is what's displayed right now. When all the controls have done loading, hide the loading panel. But because I don't have a lot of controls here, I created a fake 2-second timeout, and then I hide the loading panel. And that's all that's happening here. So if we take a look at this in the browser, you'll see the first thing that happens is the loading panel pops up, 2 seconds later, it disappears. So that's excellent because for free, without Hook writing a bunch of JavaScript, you've got this client-side event that lets you do that. And you can do this with the postback approach as well. So for example, if I hit postback here, it creates the exact same effect that you can see by taking a look here. Now it's doing the exact same thing, except that I've got one little extra method here which I create that says is postback that I can read on the client side, and then if it's true, I set it to show, and then do the exact same thing as on load. So it's an excellent method, and you can do a lot of things with it. As I mentioned, you can also use, for example, the end callback event. So let's say you've got a grid view control, and perhaps it's taking long, or perhaps every time they do a paging or sorting or something like that, you want to display a message on the client side, or you want to update something, a chart or something like that. You can hook into this event and then easily get that effect that you desired. And we also give you this browser resize, window resized event. This tells you when the end user resizes the browser. So you don't have to write anything particular. Just drop the ASPX Global Events control on a page and use the browser window resized event to get at that. Now in the sales viewer, I just want to quickly show you, we actually used the event to resize, actually to redo the animation effect. So for example, here we've got the global events. I used the controls initialized, which is actually declared in helper.js. And if we take a look at controls initialized, you'll see all I'm doing is setting this constant, ASPX animation constants, that sets the default value for the animation speed of many of the controls, for the charts or for the image controls and so forth. Now you might be thinking, wow, I have access to that? Now you do, but I warn you that you should be careful with it. Now in this case, we sped it up. We decreased it to 250 milliseconds, but there is a range, and I believe 250 is on the lower end. So I wouldn't set this to 0 or something like that. But let's say some of your end users have a faster browser or a faster connection, and they're not going to be affected by faster animation speeds and so forth. So in this case, it works perfectly, especially for a dashboard-heavy style application as the sales viewer is. So You can do a ton of great things with this approach. Now, if you're not sure what to do with the global events, or if you're just curious and you want to learn more, go to the DevExpress search, look at many of the support tickets for the ASPx global events, and you'll find things like how to use the global events for the validation completed event. So when the end user has completed validation, if it all checks out, you can display a custom message or whatever you want to do. Things with resizing, as I mentioned, things with callbacks. There's all sorts of things. It's really powerful, as Don mentioned. It allows you to take your experience with DevExpress controls to the next level. Because you may not be aware, but DevExpress client side is very, very powerful. All right, so let's move on, and I want to talk about this last example, and that's opening links with a hyperlink. Now,
but why do you want to do that, Mehul?
All right, so that's a great question, Don. Right, like a hyperlink by definition opens links. So why would you open a hyperlink without it, right? I mean, why would you open a link without a hyperlink? Well, there's really only one good scenario for this, and that is best displayed by showing you the sales viewer demo. All right, so in the sales viewer, if you take a look at the about screen, which is this helpful little question mark, it gives you this pop-up, and in the pop-up, we've got items that say, look, how we constructed this. We use donut and bar charts. We've got a track bar and a pop-up control, and these are all links. So if I click on this link here, it does a pop-up, explains the web chart control, and that's what these other things do. And then I've got a button that says OK, that says, hey, get rid of that pop-up, right? Because it's a modal pop-up and takes focus and all that. But if you'll notice is the reason why we create these demos is not just to show our current customers, but we want to attract new ASP.NET customers as well. And so we figured that a lot of new ASP.NET customers, when they first see, because a lot of times, when you first say, oh, you have a grid, oh, you have a chart, well, how does they work? Well, that's what we create these demos for, to show you what's possible. And so the main goal of this website is to get people to try our free trial. Now, the second main goal, of course, is to be educational as well, but one of the main goals is for new customers is to say, hey, listen, this thing is so amazing, I want to get it. So right away you can see that our eye's drawn to this download free trial. It takes the most focus. But it's not a link. But if I click it, what happens is a new window is opened up, and I'm taking to this try before you buy page. And we track all of this stuff to figure out where people are doing our trial and all that stuff, so we can best help customers. We've got all sorts of things that we want to figure out, is this helpful for customers? And so this is actually a link, but you'll see it actually looks like a button. So why would you do that? Well, one, sometimes a button, sometimes people feel more comfortable clicking a button. Now, yes, I can try to style this, and it's possible to do this with a hyperlink. I just find that if I'm using a certain theme and I've got an ASPxButton control, the theme can just pick up on it, so no matter what theme I use from DevExpress. So, is this hard to do? It's actually not. And so let's take a look at this in Sales Viewer. So if we take a look at the site.master page, you will find that we've got this pop-up control. Now, in the pop-up control, I've got those links that I mentioned for charts and all that kind of good stuff. But if you take a look at the footer, I've got those buttons that I mentioned. So I've got one button that says OK, that all it does when you click it is hide the pop-up, which is what I wanted to do. But the call to action button, the CTA, is the one that I want them to click, the action that I want them to take, which is to download this. And when I click this, it does a client-side method to redirect to trial page. So what is redirect to trial page? Well, let's take a look. Now, if you watched Julian's helpful webinar a couple weeks ago, he mentioned this tip, and that's why we have most of our functions in a separate JavaScript file here, and that is helper.js. So in helper.js, I've got this redirect to trial page, and in it, I've got a variable called win. What win does, it just calls a standard JavaScript window function, and it says, listen, call open. And in it, I pass my URL and one parameter that says blank. And so what that does is blank is, if you're familiar with the A tag and the href parameters and all that, is that tells it to open it in a new tab or a new window. Now, we use a var because we want to make sure that call is successful. Because a lot of times client browsers, your end users' browsers, will have some type of pop-up blocker or something like that. So we want to make sure that this call was, first of all, successful. And if it was, then I want to call focus on it, which means go over and focus on that new tab. I don't want to open it up as a background tab. I want people to go to that trial window. So it's a very simple function.
But Mehul, I would consider myself as pretty well known with the client-side API of DevExpress, but what is that CP trial URL property? I haven't seen that before.
Ah, okay, so I couldn't get that past you. That's a great question, Don. And actually, one I'm glad you asked. So CP trial, if we take a look at the site.master page again, first of all, I'm calling S here. So what does S represent? Well, you know, in the wild and wonderful world of JavaScript, you can essentially pass a bunch of parameters, right? But it makes sense to use some kind of methodology, you know, some kind of naming system. So, for example, you know, in create map here, we're passing the latitude and longitude. That's obvious. So, what is redirect trial to page? Well, S generally on server side stands for sender, as E stands for event args. So usually if you see something like S comma E, that's sender and event args, or at least what they represent. And you'll see that a lot in our documentation. So S here in JavaScript represents the sender. So what is the sender in this example? Well, the sender in this example is, as you'll notice, we're not, and you know, I recommend you watch Julian's webinar on JavaScript, but basically we don't, because we don't need to pass those explicit parameters, because what's happening is because I'm calling it from this control, it's sending the client-side object for ASPxButton, which is the ASPX client button. And so in this case, redirect to trial page, S represents that client-side object of the button. And you might say, well, wait a minute, are you saying the button has a CP trial property? It does not, and that's what Don was just referring to. So what the heck is this CP trial? Well, the DevExpress controls, as I mentioned, are not just powerful on the client side, giving you a lot of functionality, they're also extensible. So if you need to add a client-side property like we have done, you can use this custom JS properties method. And this is a server-side method. So what happens is, if you take a look on the server side, when you override this method, you have access to add to the custom property event args a new property. And what we've done is added one called CP trial. Now in this case, I've called it CP for client property, but you can call it anything you want. And then that is created. So once this is called from the server side, it is then added to the client side collection, and you can easily access it. So opening hyperlinks with a hyperlink is a useful tip when you want a button style instead of a hyperlink style. And it's, yes, it's possible with the ASPX hyperlink and CSS, but this may just be easier. All right, Don, I'm going to hand over the screen to you, and you're going to be talking, I guess, about caching small charts. Now, I remember we talked a lot with caching on the last webinar. So, Don, are we obsessed with caching?
Yes, I am.
Yeah,
I
it's
am
not a bad thing.
Yeah, I'm always in a need for speed, and yeah, caching is such a great tool as long as you be aware of what the consequences are. So yeah, I'm gonna cache a small chart, and well, actually we've done that in the Sales Viewer demo, and I'm gonna show you what we have cached and how we have done that. And you can determine your own applications if it is something that you can use as well. So let me switch over to my browser, which has the Sales Viewer demo, because what you saw at the bottom is this control which has like that chart on top of it, and you can like slide those buttons, and you can actually go to the left side again, and you can yeah, you can select ranges. And as you can see, the chart is being updated once something has been changed. And well, this control is not a standard control, but it basically contains 4 DevExpress controls. And let me show you how we have assembled that by drawing something on my screen. Oh, I have to pick the rectangle one, obviously. So here we have like a chart, And underneath we have like a track control, and then on the side we have a button here and we have a button over here. So this is looking as one control, but we have taken 4 of our controls and put it all together. And let me switch over to Visual Studio to show how to do that. I will continue with the live demo that I've been doing in the last webinar, which will be available on GitHub. So I will extend it, and you can just get a copy and play with it. Let me add a web form, which I'll call chart. And what I'll do here, let me first remove this. Doesn't make too much sense for HTML5. I will put in a bit of code which will contain the buttons as well as the chart, and I will load some default static data in the charts to make sure that everything is going and that I don't need to bind to any data. So here is the code, and let me show you how this looks design time. This is basically how it looks.
So, Don, it looks like it's just a chart with a track bar and the 2 buttons.
Exactly.
Nice. So that's a pretty cool effect. What kind of chart was that, by the way?
This chart, let me show you, because we can just pop up the designer, the wizard, and let me get a designer in the other screen. It is called a swift plot chart in this case. It's also known as a spark line.
Ah, okay. And spark lines are great when you're showing a lot of information in a short period, kind of like stocks or something like that, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And that is, in this case, well, I only put in, let me show you while I'm at it. I've only put in a number of static values here to get a bit of a sparky effect. But obviously the more data you put in, the nicer the chart is looking, just as in the Sales Viewer demo. But again, it's just to give you an impression on how this is done. So if I also run this, we'll see that it will just be, that is just too bad. Let me quickly reboot my web server and try again.
You've overlaid IIS again, haven't you?
ASPxButton, and I can feel it any second, man. But anyway, so this is, well, I didn't do the exact styling, and I mean, we've spent a lot of time on the styling and the Sales Viewer demo, but this is basically, if you remove all the styling from the Sales Viewer demo, it will look like this.
Nice. And then, of course, we hooked into the callback events to update the charts. It's very cool.
Absolutely, yeah. So, but there is one thing that we had considered since we were looking at the Sales Viewer demo to improve the speed and stuff, and there was like some functional behavior which allowed us to implement some caching on that chart. Because if I switch back to the Sales Viewer demo, the chart that you see here, it will basically only change when you hit one of those buttons. So if I go to the right, now you'll see the chart change, the spark line. So, and this control is being drawn on every page. I mean, if I go to another page like products or whatever, you'll notice that it is there again. And what we did is we would cache this chart when those positions of the begin and the end positions are not changing. And we are caching it as an image. So what we are looking at is basically an image which will in some scenarios will be redrawn. And that is also pretty simple to set up. So let me switch back to Visual Studio. If I go back to the source view, then you'll notice that we have the chart control here. So let me put in a new page which will do the caching and the drawing. I'll name it draw chart. I think I just should remove that P. And what I'll do here, I will just copy over the entire chart control here. And I will cut it out and paste it right back in here. And before this will run, you saw me do that already. Let me also copy out these ones and put them in there as well, so everything will run. So this page will only contain the chart. What I'll do now, I'll implement some code behind on this, and I will just put that in the page load event. And what I will put in there is basically to draw this chart, to render it to an image. So what I'll do here, and I have just copied out some code from the Sales Viewer demo, so you can find it there as well. And I've made a couple of smaller changes, but the principle remains the same. Let me quickly resolve a number of things like this, and I need this one. All right, so what I've done here is I will request a query string W and a query string H, which stands for the width and the height. So I can actually specify the dimensions of the chart as an image. What I'll do next, I mean, in the Sales Viewer demo, we have like a whole database behind it. So I will obviously bind some data to it. And the start date and the end date are the positions which allows us to do something with the cache. And I have commented them out here, but I will get them as well, just by the query string request. What I'll do next is I will set the content type of the response. I will set it to image.png, and by creating a memory stream, I am able to export this image to a PNG, and that will be copied into that stream. And the last thing is, after resetting the stream position, I will just copy that binary output to the output stream of the response object. So if I request this page, it will serve me an image. And also that I can show you, because if I just hit Control F5, this is the chart, as an image. If I right click it, you can see it is copy image or image location or whatever. While if I go back to the chart page, this is like, it will probably also look like an image, but this is like a generated image depending on the figures. So the next step, what I can do to make this cacheable is if I switch back to Visual Studio, I can specify a number of cache directives in my markup, and in my situation the cache should only expire once I change the width and the height query string parameters. And this is just standard ASP.NET behavior, and this will go on the application cache, but this is the only thing I need to configure. So my object will remain for a day, or if the width and the height parameters are changed, then it will be dropped from the cache and it will be done all over again. And that saves you quite a bit of server resources when requesting pages. The last step is that I will go to the chart.aspx page, and I already put it in comments here. Instead of the chart control, I can now simply request an image, and with the image URL I will call the draw chart ASPX with the appropriate query string parameters, and if I now run it again, it has taken my cached image. Because if I check this one out, and I will see what the URL is, it is the drawchart.aspx. So this is one approach on caching charts.
So that's excellent. So basically, our ASP.NET server-side charts are essentially generating images, and what you've done is said, okay, the chart doesn't change a lot. It's kind of mostly static information that changes maybe in a day. And so to get a big performance gain, especially as we did with SalesViewer, we said, listen, let's not keep asking the server to regenerate that image. You know, going to the database, getting the values. Let's just say, and by just specifying output cache, IIS is smart enough to say, okay, listen, that's the URL. Oh, I've already got that image cached. I don't need to go back to the server. I can just pull it out from the cache and save a ton of time.
Absolutely, yeah, and it saves computation as well. I mean, the chart doesn't need to be recalculated every time.
That's excellent. That's excellent. But and I like that you can also set in parameters in case you need to have a different chart that can be cached as well, right? So awesome.
Yeah. So that is one of the things that that we did to increase some performance. One of the other things that I'm going to talk about is something that we have on our other product lines as well, and we don't really have a control, an ASP.NET control for that, and that is called the Bing integration with Bing Maps. We have some questions about it, like why don't you make a control out of it, etc., etc. Well, you'll see that it is actually not too difficult to implement the Bing Maps control, and there is not that much code needed for it, and especially if you want to do some customized things, you might run into problems with like a standard control. So I'll show you how that works, and let me first switch over to the SalesViewer demo. Where was that again? The SalesViewer demo has a customer page, and that customer page has a map. And you can zoom in, you can zoom out, and as soon as you go to another one, you'll see that the map is being redrawn, and that's all being done by callbacks, etc., etc. And I mean, you can see where every customer is located. So what I'll do, I'm going to show you 4 steps which are involved for implementing such a control on a page. And what I'll do here is I'll go to Visual Studio. First, let me go back to my browser, because there is one thing you need to do first. You have to create a Bing Maps account. And next, after you have created a Bing Maps account, which is free, you need to generate an application key. And in my case, this is the application key. And you should basically keep that key for yourself, because they are measuring the amount of traffic which is coming in on that key. But there is another measure, which is the URL that you need to specify. So in case you want to tweet this key, be my guest. It's not going to work. Hang on a second.
Let me put that on Twitter.
Do that, man. While you're doing that, I will change the key. Because you can obviously change the key at any time, but then you need to change it in your software as well. But I mean, for this scenario, I will just keep this key. Otherwise, I have to change it in my demo as well. I'll go back to my Visual Studio project, and I'll set up a new page that is going to be called Bing. And again, it's doing this. Let me remove that. So once we have that account, we can include some placeholder in our page, and we need a bit of JavaScript to activate this whole Bing API, which is also JavaScript based. So what I'll do first is I'll put in a small div. And I'm gonna do it slightly different as what we are doing in the sales viewer demo. It's a bit more nicer, and it's reusable in this case also. I've specified a simple div with an ID which is map container. Next, I have specified a data parameter as well, a data attribute with a latitude and a longitude. And with HTML5 you can create those data dash attributes yourself, and you can do something useful with it. I could, for instance, also use a server expression. So I could, for instance, remove this, and I could use this kind of construct to get something server-side pasted in here. But I will now keep it fixed coordinates. The second thing that we need is we need to include some JavaScript, which you will get from Microsoft once you have signed up for this Bing account. And that JavaScript is looking like this. So this is basically the whole JavaScript API which is available for the Bing maps. I'll paste something else in because I'm going to need that, which is the good old jQuery. So that's going to be loaded on my page as well. And I will put in a small JavaScript file which you can reuse because it's pretty generic setup, and it has some code which is basically taken out of the sales viewer demo. And that's going to be bing.js. So let me create that bing.js file. And that is going to be called Bing. And what I'm going to put in that file is a document ready function, which is handled by jQuery. So that is the construct that we are using here. Obviously, we'll need to close that down. I'm doing one of the best practices concerning JavaScript, and that is the use of the use strict clause, which makes sure that my JavaScript is pretty okay, and there are no tricky things in there. And the next thing I'll do is, and this is something that I basically copied out of the sales viewer demo, and I can show you that if you're interested in that. But what this basically does is I'm assigning a create map function to the window object, and this is creating the map. And this is something that I've changed a bit. What you see here, which is very important, is the map options. This allows you to zoom in on the map or not, or place a custom marker, or all kinds of stuff like disable keyboard, show map type selector, etc., etc. And one of the things which is really important is the key that I created on the portal. What I've done here is I have used jQuery to locate an element which has the data latitude and the data longitude attributes, and it will position the map on those attributes. This function has like one parameter, which is the elem, and by executing a bit of other JavaScript here, this jQuery will locate every element which has a data latitude and a data longitude data attribute, and it will execute the create map function that I've just been explaining for you. So if you have like a number of maps, you can still use this code. As long as you set those attributes, you'll be fine. And in the end, I will call that window.createMaps to make sure that everything is drawn. So this is the only JavaScript that you need, and I should definitely check out the documentation about Bing concerning those map options, but because you can do some pretty interesting stuff there. And what you'll see is that we will draw that map inside the found element, and we will center the map, and we will place a push pin on it, and you can do quite a bunch of other things with it as well. And if I switch back to the page, there is one thing that I should do, and I could do that with inline styling, but since we're doing best practices, I will just put some small CSS on the top of this page and that is just to set up the div container, because the div should have a position absolute, and obviously it should have a width and a height. And once that's been set up, I can run my page, and you'll see the map. And this is Rotterdam, the city where I live. And this is basically how to set up a map in just a couple of minutes.
That's pretty easy. I mean, so I assume like integrate some external services like Bing. You probably do that with Google as well. I like Bing. Well, at least the maps are pretty good, and Microsoft has some good documentation in it as well.
Absolutely, yeah. The documentation about Bing is great, and the JavaScript support is awesome. And yeah, well, as you saw, it is just a matter of minutes setting it up. Especially if you use a script that I've just put up in the Bing.js file. It is, yeah, it's pretty easy to set it up.
Awesome. Hey, so we have no more to show, and before I hand it over, Amanda, I just want to say thanks to everybody. And if you have questions, please talk to our support team. They are highly interested in how you use our controls. They want to help you with any concerns. If you have any specific questions for Don and I, contact us at our emails. Don, can you show that slide? And then finally, we'll be putting this up. So keep an eye on my blog, and I'll put the links to the GitHub for the sample projects and all that good stuff. Amanda, thank you. Don, thank you.
Yes, you too.
Awesome. Thanks, guys. We did have one question pop up from Eric. Do you integrate Google Maps?
We don't. I think Google specifically had a little bit more, how do you say, cost or something like that. And because this is a demo, you could. Google is not difficult to integrate either. But I think there's a couple more hoops we had to jump through, in particular how we needed to use it. So being that this is a public demo on a public-facing website, we were looking at all aspects of it. But it's possible, yeah.
Yeah, and I mean I can comment on this as well, because what I was showing you was not like specific DevExpress code. This is just general HTML/JavaScript code on how to show a Bing map. So you can absolutely show a Google map as well, but the JavaScript is a bit different. The API works slightly different, but it's really not a big deal.
Great. All right, everybody, always check out our webinars page for new and upcoming content at devexpress.com/webinars. Our CTO is on the line, Julian Bucknell. You've all heard from him, and he'd like the floor.
I'd just like to add to what both Mehul and Don said. The problem about Google Maps is its licensing. I would advise anybody who wants to incorporate Google Maps into an application, not into your browser, to verify that it's possible using their license agreement. You may have noticed we don't actually provide Google Maps API support with our controls, and the reason is the licensing tends to be very restrictive. So I would plead with you all to check Google's Maps license agreement.
So thank you so much to Don and Mehul. Thank you all for joining us, and of course, thank you for choosing DevExpress. Bye-bye.